Hello, and welcome to another build video by your resident build goblin, Rofo the Gyrum. Today we're taking a look at this rune level 50 Haligtree page, which coincidentally lines up with general themes of the DLC that just got announced. Well, at the time of this recording it was just announced. It might be like 3 weeks later, but I'm hoping it only comes down to 2 weeks later. Anyways, I will say this video has been an absolute struggle to make, by the way, and not because this build is bad or because I don't like it. Quite the opposite. I can talk a little bit more about that at the end of this video because I have a whole spiel and like how it relates to something else that I want to ramble about, you know, the usual Rofo video. But what's this build all about, huh? This build is all about rings. That's right, baby, it's all about the rings. Sure, you have your triple rings of light and your Radagon rings of light. And those are some big flashy spells that feel awesome to cast, but really, it's all about plain old Discus of Light. This might seem absolutely absurd, as those of you who have been playing since Dark Souls 3 might remember the miracle Way of White Corona, and recall that it was just a straight up bad spell. Well, in Elden Ring, a game where all spells can do very real damage, Discus of Light is no exception, and now can also be chain cast. Even better though, Discus of Light costs 3 FP per cast, making it 5 times cheaper to cast than its Dark Souls 3 equivalent. This essentially crashes the FP economy of this game, as I can pump out good ranged damage for pennies on the mana cost, and even cash in on the boomerang return damage of the rings as they return to their caster. Much like the contestants on Love is Blind, nobody in this game has any respect for rings. People will often see you start to cast rings and do that cheeky thing where they strafe back and forth to show you how easy it is to dodge your projectile spam. And believe me, I'm guilty of doing the same thing to mages all the time as well. Except none of these people can possibly fathom a projectile that does 2 things, right? Much like how Magic Glintblade is the best sorcery in the game simply because it sits there for 5 seconds, causing everybody to forget about its existence, nobody seems to be able to comprehend that, yes, the rings I'm casting will continue to boomerang back to me. So for people who just do the strafe back and forth thing, I always end up scoring at least a few hits via the return cast of the rings. And for players with slightly more brain cells who will just strafe me while I cast the single ring, I simply chain cast single ring into triple rings, and that almost always, I'd say like 90% of the time, catches their strafe. I once complained about the fact that Discus of Light and triple rings don't have any hits done, but I kinda like that trait now, because I've noticed that players don't seem to appreciate how much damage they're taking if an attack doesn't stun them and vibrate their controller when they get hit. You might ask, how exactly are you pumping out that much damage per cast of the singular ring? And in order to properly answer that question, I'll just have to show you the stats and the gear. Yes, we are Sorcial Gaming. America Sorcial, that is. Is this twinking? Well, I made a whole video on whether or not I think this sort of thing is twinking and whether or not any of that really matters, because twinking is kind of a useless term at this point, and I still get the world's dumbest comments on it from both PvEers and PvPers. So I kind of regret making that video entirely. But to make a short answer long, yes, I am twinking. Does it really matter in the slightest? I don't think so, because you can reduce this build to a coughing baby with a couple of smacks from a frost-infused greatsword or halberd. If I wanted to really twink to win invasions, I sure as shit wouldn't be wearing America Sorcial and casting Discus of Light. What is incredibly powerful about this build is the +4 Golden Order Seal, which has a significantly higher spell buff than any other catalyst in the game at +4 or +10 upgrade levels. I definitely need to mention that most of this build has been largely inspired by a player by the name of Halo, who spent quite a bit of time torturing me with their rings build while I was gathering footage to make my Elden Ring multiplayer critique. I am still of the mind that their build is quite a bit more clever than mine, as they don't even have America Sorcial on their build, and instead gain a few extra stats by wearing Renala's banana hat and the Commoner's Garb, which combine to give quite a few more stats into Faith and Intelligence, without any of the sort of downsides that America Sorcial has. They also painfully introduced me to the concept of Sacred Blade on Sacred Infused Shamshir as a way to get damage for this build, and it was a painful but formative experience to say the very least. Something you might notice about this build is that I have 11 strength, which limits which weapons I can use to basically only straight swords, curved swords, and daggers. This has actually been a pretty fun limitation, as it's forced me to actually learn how to play with those weapons a bit more, and I have to say I finally get straight swords now. I would be remiss not to shout out Blue Caduceus and his straight sword video, since a lot of the things they said in that video really made straight swords click for me, whereas watching like many Saint Riot streams and his like 5 different straight sword builds for many hours didn't really help me with straight swords at all. And the thing is, there are still plenty of better weapon classes than straight swords. Like, for example, straight swords still aren't the greatest weapon for chasing down your opponents, but they do tend to have very fun R2s, especially the Miquella Knight Sword. Is using the Miquella Knight Sword twinking? Probably, but then again, I could just put Sacred Blade on a Sacred Infused Noble Slender Sword, and then just do the same damage with more range and a less fun R2. But I want that fun R2, plus the Miquella Knight Sword works with the lore of this build. Speaking of the build's lore, let's talk about it. Throughout many of the keeps and castles of the lands between, there seem to be pages from Leyndell, so I thought to myself, why doesn't the Haligtree have pages? The Haligtree is like kind of this mirror image to Leyndell in a lot of ways, minus the genocide and the general repression of its population. But other than that small difference, it's a pretty like mirror image of Leyndell. And so I was thinking to myself, why doesn't the Haligtree have pages of their own? And that's essentially what this build is. They're a Haligtree page, and like many residents of the Haligtree, they're also a little bit of a misbegotten, because that seems to be like the one refuge they can go to in the lands between. I was playing with some of the people who inspired me to make a rings build, and they kept mocking me for using Crucible incantations on it. But like, I'm using them for a very specific lore reason. Misbegotten and the Crucible Knights are all very closely related to the Crucible and its tendency of endowing those close to it with these bizarre mutations. And throughout the Haligtree, there's all these Misbegotten who have taken refuge there. And one of the things that all the Crucible incantations does is it turns like a part of the caster into like a different part of another animal. So you have like the Crucible horn, or you have like the Crucible tail. This is all to say, I'm using the lore justification of being like this Misbegotten Haligtree page to cast Dragonclaw. I mean, like, look how much damage one Dragonclaw does, and it chain casts into other things. Are you kidding me? Are you telling me that I'm gonna make a spellcaster build that has enough faith, and then also just so happens to have just the right amount of arcane? Like, are you gonna tell me to not cast Dragonclaw? No, it's not gonna happen. It's getting cast. It's getting cast twice. That's just what's happening. Anyways, but I do actually use the other aspect of the Crucible spells. I enjoy using Tail aspect of the Crucible to smack people who are hiding behind corners, as well as Breath, which is basically honest and sexy dragon breath. Tried to make Crucible Horn work, but it just doesn't have good enough tracking to make it work the way I want it to for this build. I'll find some use for it in the future. I have a couple other plans with like Crucible incantations, etc. Because there's like a lot of themes throughout this game of like different people and different factions having these different body parts that resemble like dragons or different creatures. So I will get around to using Horn. I have a plan for how I'm going to use Horn. It's just not going to go on a build as squishy as this. And also, hey, DLC looks like it might have some more stuff for us Crucible enjoyers. Moving right along, let's talk about the other spells I use on this build. As I've mentioned before, I love comboing the first cast of Dragonclaw into other spells. If the first cast of Dragonclaw hits, like any other cast of Dragonclaw, it does a lot of damage, but if the first one hits, Pest Threads is actually a really great follow-up and chase down all in one. Pest Threads in general is a pretty good spell for killing people who don't seem to know how to roll, but that's beside the point. Any incantation that can be chain cast in general is a great follow-up for Dragonclaw, so like Bestial Sling or Stone of Garank, but my personal favorite is definitely Bloodflame Talons. For a while I was trying to combo Dragonclaw into Burn O Flame, but Bloodflame Talons ended up being a safer, more FP efficient way to chain cast a delayed explosion spell. Please do not try to question why I'm using Bloodflame Talons on a Haligtree character. Let's just focus on the Talons aspect of it and not talk about the Bloodflame. Let's move on. I mentioned Radagon's Rings of Light in passing, but this is weirdly enough a fantastic spell to cast from neutral. Like, because its cast time is kind of slow and I'm also charging the spell with base cast speed, it comes out really slow. So most people mistime their roll on it and just get obliterated. Also, because the range on it is pretty good, you can cast it from neutral against the more passive parties you fight, and still hit them pretty easily. The only thing you can't really do is cast it against a super aggressive party, because it has no hyper armor and gets interrupted very easily. I've also seen Haligtree cast it as a wake up, and it actually might be the second best wake up in the game outside of Grail's Roar. Another more under the radar spell I like to use is Law of Causality, which I like to think of as Blender Insurance. Here I use it knowing that at some point this Millennia cosplay will try to waterfowl dance me again, and Causality works as like this perfect counter for this absolute war crime of a Nation of War. Law of Causality is essentially karmic justice from Dark Souls 1, but worse in practically every way. It doesn't really scale with spell buffs like it should, it requires quite a lot of int to cast despite being an incantation, and also sometimes it just fails to go off. Like a third of the time, it just doesn't go off, and you're left having just face tanked 5 slashes from a katana with nothing to show for it except a bleed out. For this reason, trying to make your opponents set off Law of Causality is a very dangerous game to play, and instead should be treated as a fun little bonus if you blunder into a blender. But that's about all the details I want to get into for this build. Would I recommend you make a rings build? Probably not, because I don't really want to fight anyone else who casts rings at me. I'd much rather prefer to be the distributor of the projectile spam rather than the receiver. But after careful consideration, I'd love to get invaded by original builds that aren't just some variation of Dragon Halberd or Flaming Strike Halberd. That'd be cool. So yeah, maybe go make a rings build right now and leave your 25 Stormhawks in your bottomless box for once in your sweaty life. But yeah, it's a fun build. This is actually me fully endorsing making a rings build. They're a lot of fun. Would definitely recommend. Alright, it's time for the rambling part of this video. So I do want to talk about that trailer, but I don't have any particularly hot takes about it, so instead I'll probably just be talking about the community's excitement and the response to the trailer. Let me set the stage for this by complaining about how unnecessarily difficult this video was to make. It's more to do with the fact that I had to do a hard reset on my PC like a couple weeks ago, and then that apparently messed up my settings in OBS, which is how I record invasions. So I did like 3 hours worth of invasions, got like 20 clips, and then when I went back to review them, they all came out blurry because my encoder settings had been set at the lowest quality. But for once, I had a whole day to myself, so I changed up my settings to the highest possible quality, did another 2 to 3 hours of invasions, got even more clips, and then when I went to review them, they were all like the last 12 seconds of every invasion, because when I selected the highest possible encoder settings, it apparently capped the replay buffer at a certain memory usage, which meant that it was only capable of saving like 12 seconds worth of footage at a time. So I did like another 3 hours worth of invasions, and that's most of what you're seeing here right now. So I just spent like the whole Saturday invading. That's like 10 hours of invasions that just flew by, and I didn't even consider for a second, man, I'm just getting invasion after invasion. And it wasn't until Monday that my dumbass was like, hey, that was fucking weird, what happened there? Well, obviously the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer had just come out, and Elden Ring's player count on Steam peaked at like 100k players over the weekend, which is just absolutely insane to me. For reference, Dark Souls 3's all-time peak on Steam was 129k when the game launched, and I don't think it ever climbed up past 50 ever again in any of like the launches of the other DLCs. And this is just after like, you know, showing one 3-minute trailer 4 months ahead of the DLC's launch. It's difficult for me to comprehend how popular these games have become, and I think it's also difficult for the PvP community to accept this as well. I saw a few videos from PvP content creators after the trailer dropped about how none of the interviews with Miyazaki that accompanied this trailer even asked about PvP and how disappointed they were in that. And to these people who share this sentiment, I'd ask that you think about what the point of Miyazaki doing these interviews is in the first place. It is to generate hype, so that the same player base who bought 20 million copies of the base game will also spend $40 on this expansion. And I'm going to be brutally honest about this, PvP does not sell copies of this game. Not because it's bad or because the strictly PvE players would get mad or anything like that, it's because they simply are not aware of the existence of PvP at all. When I talk to people at my job, people who make video games as their full-time job and then also play an insane amount of video games in their spare time as well, they are honestly very surprised they learn that these games have PvP at all when I tell them about it. The other day, I was listening to a podcast from a couple of game insiders and journalists who I'd describe as pretty hardcore gamers, and they even said something along the lines of, "Man, I wish we could both play through the Dark Souls series again sometime. Do these games even have co-op?" Like, these are people who've beaten all the Dark Souls games and were just unaware of the existence of co-op for, the 80, 120 plus hours it took them to beat all 3 Dark Souls games. My point here is that the multiplayer of these games is not a well-marketed feature, and to many people it is not a memorable aspect of them. And that doesn't mean these multiplayer experiences are any less meaningful for you or I, people who obviously are super into the multiplayer of these games. I can practically guarantee you Shadow of the Erdtree will have some cool stuff in relation to multiplayer. All From Software DLC always has, but I can also assure you that they do not plan on spending any precious marketing time on that. Despite the old monk from Demon Souls being one of Miyazaki's favorite boss fights in all of his games, not once did he mention or even hint that this exact fight would be making a return in any of the promotional interviews on the lead up to the Ring DLC. This is all to say, Shadow of the Erdtree will have something multiplayer related. I'm 99% positive about that. And even if it doesn't, we'll have new weapons, armor, and spells to play with in PvP. Will they be broken upon release? Yes, of course. Will they still be broken after several patches? Also yes. Only sometimes do these things actually get fixed. But that's always been the case for From Software. Like the Ring City DLC for Dark Souls 3 introduced 2 weapons alone in just that DLC that had guaranteed 3-hit true combos in a game where everything else had 2. And then they just never patched out those combos. Yes, we had patches after the Ring City DLC launched, but they never fixed those 3-hit combos or any of the super broken stuff, and we kind of lived with those patches for 5 years until Elden Ring came out. But I don't want to dampen the hype. I'm really excited for all the new stuff we get to play with in the DLC. I mean, just from the trailer, there's 3 incantations I'd throw on this build immediately if I could. So my general message here is maybe don't freak out that multiplayer isn't mentioned at all when it comes to the DLC. One last point I wanted to make before I end this video. It's a little bit about the DLC and things people are asking for. Something I keep seeing people request for Shadow of the Erdtree is an infusion that scales with intelligence and faith. And I gotta say, I don't think we need that at all. I mean, is there really anyone out there whose build lacks damage in Elden Ring? Everyone in this game does a lot of damage, even the int faith builds despite not having a dedicated infusion. You can just easily pump out stupid damage with Sacred Blade on a Sacred Infused weapon, or Flaming Strike on a Flame Art Infused weapon. I guess the only thing missing is a projectile-based Ash of War that buffs a weapon with magic damage, but hey, I think int builds are kinda good on their ability to do really good damage from range. I guess I just really don't feel like we need a dark damage equivalent in a game where there's already a defined meta that is head and shoulders above everything else in terms of burst damage. Don't get me wrong, I think a couple more int and faith scaling weapons would be a welcome addition. You want to throw a unique faith and int scaling greatsword at us? Go for it. Maybe that cut twin blade of abundance? A Miquella's scythe or something? Let's do it. A faith and int scaling katana would most certainly be pushing it though. And if I see you wielding a faith and int scaling halberd after this DLC, I am blocking you so goddamn hard. But anyways, those are my rants, those are my rambles. That is all from you guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.